The Evil Within is amateur. It's a flat pancake of a video game that feels like too many colors of silly putty smeared into a gray blob. For every clever decision it makes, there are a dozen counterpoints that make it hard to tell if a good idea was just hammered into place, or if the bad ideas are covering gold. It's as disjointed as they come, with aesthetic inconsistencies, fundamentally different gameplay between the game's difficulty settings, and as such, wildly incompatible level design, and still, nothing is as misguided as the game's narrative pacing. Critically, The Evil Within suffers from being a game that feels linear. More often than not, linearity is a signal that you should be focusing on what is in front of you, and lots of games have used it as an effective tool to drive story. Make no mistake, even open-world games hope to have plots affecting enough that when the story starts to ramp up, you aren't stopping to smell the roses. And here's the thing, The Evil Within is broken up into chapters that each try to have rising and falling tension, and for over half of the game you're bereft of any meaningful intrigue or reason why the protagonist Sebastian should continue to barrel ahead through the game's hellish setting. It's not to say that abstract linearity is inherently bad, one of the year's best games is both a horror game and aggressively linear, but that The Evil Within in particular just has no idea what it's doing. At the start of the game you're brought in to investigate a murder scene, even though, as it turns out, the massacre is still ongoing. At which point you arrive in a surreal hellscape where you begin to search for those who arrived on the scene of the crime with you. And for most of the game, that's it. That's the plot. And then quite abruptly you're confronted with not just what the hell is going on, but why it is. And I'm going to spoil some of that for you because it makes up some of the most interesting moments in the game, so you've been warned. Spoilers. As it turns out, the game's antagonist, Ruvik, who is leading the murders you were sent to investigate, is the arbiter of the world Sebastian and company are stuck in. And what makes all of this so fascinating is the way that Ruvik's tortured past informs a lot of the game's bosses. For example, Ruvik's older sister was burned alive, saving him from a barn fire, and the older sister manifests in the world as a repeating encounter who can only be damaged by flames. It's quite smart. Unfortunately, the game never comes up with a clever explanation for the zombie fodder that makes up the bulk of your encounters. Rather than continuing to rail against the game's many outright bad decisions, like being a highly letterboxed game that constantly has collectibles and traps on the ground so that as a player you're constantly forced to stare at the least interesting thing imaginable, the floor, I'll just close by saying that The Evil Within gets very few things right without any caveats. As a stealth game, it has no mood because of how often you'll be forced to repeat areas. As an action game, it does nothing new and doesn't have enough variety to keep things interesting. And as a story game, the plot is just poorly paced. It wouldn't be the first flawed horror game, but it isn't even consistent enough to have a unified motif to keep the whole thing together. It's a game whose motto could be, wouldn't it be cool if? And then as players, we get to double check and see if the idea was any good. This aimless intent wreaks havoc on everything it touches, and it leaves The Evil Within feeling like a pastiche of survival horror. It has suspense! In essence, the game's punishing gameplay is a brushstroke on its canvas. Romance!
I do it a little naked.
I do it without clothes on. Adventure! Sometimes it's easy to forget how modern Hideo Kojima games tend to be. Laughter!
Telephone conversation.
He doesn't even dial.
It's been a long time since you used a rotary telephone, huh? All opinions, all in progress. Castle Couch.